Hello again. Until a few weeks ago, Reform were riding very high in the opinion polls, and both the approaching local elections and the by-election in Runcorn were looking like open goals. Now, after the row between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe, things do not seem quite as rosy. Matters were not helped when Nigel Farage explicitly ruled out the idea of mass deportation, dismissing the idea as politically impossible. This was after President Trump had begun uh, carrying out mass deportations, and many of the people that support reform thought it would be a good idea to have something like that going on in this country. It has not gone down at all well with the grassroots supporters of reform and has essentially split the party. Not what you want before an election. Mass deportations or expulsions may well be politically impossible, but there are no insurmountable obstacles to carrying out such actions looked at purely as an exercise in logistics. Indeed, we have done similar things in the past, notably during the First World War. The expression concentration camp really only acquired negative connotations during and after the Second World War. British newspapers in 1914 and 1915 did not hesitate to talk of the concentration camps which were being set up throughout the whole of Britain. The purpose of these camps was, more often than not, to concentrate in one place foreigners who might not be fully supportive of the British war effort. These men were almost exclusively German and Austrian, although there was also a leavening of Turks and Bulgarians. Many had lived in Britain for years, sometimes many decades. There was no real suggestion that they posed any threat to British interests. It was enough that they had been born in an enemy country. Defence of the Realm regulations provided the legal framework for interning civilians from other countries, but it's likely that the government was not, at least at first, especially keen to implement such measures. Some Germans living in this country were young men of military age who might conceivably have wished to return to their own country at the outbreak of war to enlist in the German army and fight against British. Most, though, had lived in Britain for years. Often they were married to English women and in some cases had become naturalised British citizens. They were pork butchers, waiters, bakers and jewellers who had no more desire to see a German victory than anybody else living in the United Kingdom. Such was the popular feeling, an almost hysterical fear of spies and saboteurs, that the authorities thought it prudent to cater for the ordinary person's prejudices and arrest some of these innocent men, sending them to concentration camps. Now, I'm going into this to show that it's quite possible when the will is there, the political will is there, to undertake such an exercise to track down people who were born in foreign countries, who are even naturalised British citizens. It's not hard to do if you really want to. These concentration camps were set up all over England. In March 1915, a concentration camp was established at Alexandra Palace in North London for so-called enemy aliens. These were Austrians and Germans who had been living in the United Kingdom when the war began. Some of them had arrived as babes in arms and knew no other country than Britain. Nevertheless, such men were technically German or Austrian, even if they couldn't speak a single word of German. The camp at Alexandra Palace held over 3,000 men. It wasn't the biggest, though. I mean, the one at Camberley in Surrey held almost 9,000 people. It proved easy enough to round up Germans and Austrians and lock them away in such camps. The ultimate intention was to remove them from the country. So in other words, arresting these people, identifying them and arresting them, and then herding them into internment camps or concentration camps, call them what you will, was the first stage in mass deportation. There is a modern expression for developments of this kind, where a specific ethnic or national minority is driven from cities, locked in concentration camps, and then later deported from the country. It is ethnic cleansing. It might sound like an exaggeration until we look at the figures involved in this particular case. In the 1911 census, 31,254 German-born residents have been recorded in the County of London, that part of the city excluding the outer suburbs. By 1921, this figure had fallen to 9,083. In 1911, there had been 8,869 Austrian-born people in the same district. By 1921, there were only 1,552. It was a fairly efficient process. The calls for the internment of enemy aliens in concentration camps continued on and off for the whole of the war. There were renewed demands in 1918 following the bombing of London by German air raids and also reverses in the field on the Western Front. In the summer of 1918, the very year that the war ended, there were mass rallies in London calling for any Germans still at liberty to be arrested and sent to concentration camps. On the 13th of July 1918, an enormous rally was held in London's Trafalgar Square. It was said to be the biggest meeting held there since the war had begun. Messages were read out from people as varied and disparate as musical star Harry Lauder and Rudyard Kipling. All called for the immediate internment of all Germans, men and women, whether they were naturalised British citizens or not. The government, mindful of the fact that as soon as the war had ended there would be a general election, gave in to these demands, setting up a new Enemy Aliens Advisory Committee. The task of this body was to examine all those Germans and Austrians who had so far been given exemption from internment. In addition to revoking the naturalisation of some Germans who had become British citizens, deportations to Holland were stepped up. In September 1918, over 200 men a week were being taken from the concentration camps, shipped across the Channel and dumped penniless in Holland. I've outlined this piece of history merely to point out that the detention and mass deportation of foreigners from Britain has been undertaken in the past with little difficulty. The only problems are indeed, just as Nigel Farage said, political rather than practical. It can be done, but it might prove politically difficult.